Thanks. This is an insurance-related question, and I was wondering about how insurance companies assess the relationship between different people or organisations that they might insure. So if you have a logging company upstream and they are insured in some way, and there's also a farmer downstream, and does the insurance company sort of take into account the relationships between those people, so that the actions of sort of deforestation upstream might exacerbate flooding for another client downstream? And is there sort of any sort of overarching view that an insurance company would take where they might even refuse to work with a company that they perceive to be damaging some of their other clients?
So I would say that if you ask a question about the insurance industry overall, then of course it varies. There are quite broad global organizations of insurers and reinsurers, and there's also bodies that have been created to collaborate and look at the impact of climate change on insurers and how insurers and reinsurers deal with it as well, both in terms of their impact, in terms of the business practices, etc. I think that there is not one answer, as I said, for all, but there is work being done that has to do with the type of companies that insurers and reinsurers invest in, because of course we are big investors, and also industries that we might or might not insure. I think it's a process. And I think one of you said that there is, I think the awareness of the incredible impact of climate change, particularly, has definitely accelerated. And I certainly see change in terms of companies taking a position and saying we will or will not insure coal, but also different industries. But it's a process, and I think that everybody is certainly working on it, and there are different levels of commitment as well, in terms of reaching certain goals by certain deadlines, in terms of moving along. And maybe one last point that I personally find interesting, and in part at least encouraging, is that there has been traditionally, there's been the sense that generally insurers headquartered in Europe were sort of further along in that process, whether it's on the CSR side, corporate social responsibility, or generally that commitments to the environment. And having, again, just remembering a recent trip to Latin America, seeing very tiny regional, local banks, maybe more than insurers, but actually looking at that and putting this type of principles in practice, I find it very encouraging, because I think it's one of those things that, again, not anyone, even large company, is going to solve it, right? It's got to be sort of a movement that is going to really have an impact and an effect. So I found that quite encouraging.
Hi, my question's around, it was sort of suggested earlier that humanitarian organisations were sort of late to the game in terms of taking climate change seriously. And just to go back to what Francesca said about like sort of domestic violence, well, humanitarian organisations have understood for decades what happens after disasters, how it impacts the sexual assault, women's education and things like this. So why do you think that in the early 90s, when the world sort of started to become aware that climate change would increase like the severity and frequency of natural disasters, that humanitarians weren't the first ones saying, well, this is what's going to happen afterwards? Why has it taken 30 years for humanitarian organisations to shout out about the things which they already knew happened?
I would say as well, on top of funding, it's also a case of organisation, because you could say with humanitarian organisations, we've been responding to disasters forever, and why haven't we learned how to respond better? For example, with Boxing Day tsunami, it's quite poor organised response. The worst one was Haiti, when no planes could land for a few days. So I think what's been quite good in the last 10 years is organisations communicating with each other and sharing lessons learned. And actually, in the 80s, I mean, monitoring and evaluation within NGOs was fairly new. And so now that's at the forefront. I mean, not many organisations can get funding unless monitoring and evaluation is part of what they're proposing. So I think it will get better in terms of how we respond to disasters and communicating what the impacts of climate change are. There is also, just generally with the psychology of climate change, in the 80s we knew, okay, maybe that if the climate changes, there'll be more cases of domestic violence. But there is this case of if you don't see it, you don't believe it. And it's the same with, the whole of the sort of humanitarian sector. If you put a video on the TV screen of disaster and catastrophe, you'll get loads of funding because people see it. And the second it's off the TV, the funding stops. And I remember actually at MSF, one of the conversations people had is because they were at the forefront of Ebola, they said it was the best thing that's ever happened to the organization because all of their funding for 5 years came through Ebola. And because that funding wasn't specifically just tied for it, it's just because of the awareness of what the organization does. They got to use loads of that money for all of the sort of hidden conflicts, the ones that aren't really put on the TV. They're more stress conflicts or stress sort of disasters. So it's maybe a case of out of sight, out of mind sometimes.
Just a second for the microphone. Just have to come all the way around. I'm making Ellie walk a lot. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jay. Working in the field anyway. I find it a strange paradox that you put insurance and humanitarian in the same sentence at all, because insurance companies are in the profit-making and obviously humanitarian is a loss-making industry. So how do you, this is two questions. First question is on how do you sort of encompass risk and risk profiles? So if you say that 95% in certain regions are not covered, and how do you sort of start to put that into a risk profile to start to say, okay, we can address maybe 50%. Of course, if you cover all 95%, then the humanitarian sector would be out of business. So that's bad for us, but good for the world. So how would you firstly come and to even address sort of these smaller micro schemes of finding pooling as a solution, and to individual sort of households who have nothing, who can't afford water or have access to very basic things? How do you address those individuals? And the second question goes. That's just one. That's just the first, and the second one's about migration. Okay. So I've been working out in Honduras in a remote village for the past year and a half, and I was sat down with two executives, directors of two large humanitarian organizations, and they said to me that they were doing scoping work in Latin America, and they said to me that actually, for us to provide funding to this very remote region and these people, it would probably be better off if they moved to larger cities, because it would be more effective for aid delivery and more effective in terms of what they could get for their money in terms of donor relations, things like that, these people move. So these are, as I said, remote, isolated, indigenous communities have absolutely nothing, but their solution is, get them to move. And I think the question is, do you agree that we should be preparing for better migration so that in cases of isolation or where people don't have access to funds for better development programs, that we could provide better access through migration, as you say, better preparedness for disaster responses? That's number two.
Okay. So Jay, thank you for the first question, which I like and unexpected it. How do you put insurance and humanitarian effort in the same sentence or in the same word? To me, it's about thinking middle and long term, right? Because yes, insurance, it's a business. And if we were to donate all our capital to protect, then we could only protect a certain percentage, and at some point we couldn't provide that protection anymore, right? And as I said, the protection gap is way too big as that any one insurer or even the whole industry can cover it. But as I was preparing to speak today, I was looking up, so what exactly does humanitarian mean? And it's actually said it's the effort of providing human welfare, right? And ultimately, if you think of someone, if we go back to my example, right? Say there is someone that has just made it out of poverty, right? And it is because sometimes in India, it's a man that bought a bicycle and delivers whatever it is from A to B, or the woman with a sewing machine or whatever. If that item, right, or maybe a horse or a mule, if that one thing that provides that little family with income to live and to be out of poverty. If that gets lost, they fall back to poverty. So I think that is ultimately welfare, right? The ability to actually give food to your children or to dress them or whatever it might be. So I think there is a connection. Now, I think it's right that it is about making money, because if that woman is actually able to send her kids to school and to dress them, and then maybe they will study or learn a profession or learn whatever it might be, that is what I call it's a virtual cycle versus the vicious cycle that happens if what you have, you lose it, and then you sort of keep going down, right? And so if I know that that woman can only have insurance protection today because there are governments from the developed world that are actually helping to fund the whole scheme, right? And we as the industry are also actually helping to put that together, but that means that her children will have a better economic situation. They're going to be our clients. Great. It's great for us, but it's good for them. I almost think in a way as the difference between giving you a fish or teaching you to fish. Thank you. So that's why I think that it does go together. Your second question was about how do you put the schemes together, particularly if you think of individuals or units that they don't have the money or they don't have access to water or whatever it might be. Ultimately, without getting too technical, the way that works is, the premium that gets paid is very, very low, and there is probably the situation in certain cases. Well, let me start the other way around. We cannot insure everything. Not everything is insurable, right? There is not the capital to do it, nor is it, is it possible at all. But it is very low premiums, and as I was saying, so for example, the example of the African risk capacity. It's 19 different countries in Africa, right? And they actually put these parameters, and it works at a very simplistic level this way. So you know that in this region, the farmers are gonna plant this particular crop, and that crop needs, for example, within the first 30 days, at least 5 days of rain, but not more than 15. I'm inventing, okay? Let's say that's a parameter. So the minute that within that first month, that crop either didn't get the 5 drought, or it got way more than 15, you already know that crop is not gonna deliver for them, right? You don't have to wait the 3 months that it really takes until you would know otherwise. So that's a parameter. So that means that you know right away, okay, they're not gonna get the benefit from that crop. We know it now. So instead of waiting, now the insurance pays, and they can go and make sure that they're going to have to buy food because they're not going to be able to feed themselves or whatever it might be. That is a parametric insurance scheme, right? And it's based on indices that the people that live there and live in the region, they have the knowledge, right? They say this crop needs within these days of rain or whatever, and there is modeling and there's mathematicians in our operations that actually calculate that. And it's also about grouping it. So one farmer could not afford it, but 30 farmers in this region together can, particularly if it's also another 100 in this other region. And that is a group of risk, the way we think about it, that is diversified. So we're not insuring only these guys where it's so likely that will go badly, but we also have those over there and those over here, and that's what makes it, remember that I said it's about pooling resources from the many to the few. That's what it is. But it happens with help from organizations like the World Bank and the different parts of the World Bank group, and with particularly European countries actually funding, for example, the setup, because you have an administration in that region to actually put that together. And with companies in our industry, in part also, of course, donating time to put that together. So it's a lot of different parts. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, I'm still skeptical. It's, if it's unpredictable,
yeah.
climate change, then obviously if they have to claim, then I don't know, insurance in our world, in car insurance or whatever, then the premiums go up. So, you know, if they claim from year to year, the more unpredictable it is, the higher the premium becomes, and is it really an affordable prospect?
There are some things that are not affordable to insure, right? Because ultimately, you can insure anything, it's a matter of price. There are things that you cannot insure. And you're right. I mean, in fact, what you were talking about, and that's part of also the work that we do looking at issues like the island nations, right? Or imagine the impact that the country of Dominica. Last year, the damage that was caused in Dominica represents more than 200% of their GDP, right? If you start to see impacts like that, yes, there's a boundary to what you can cover, and that's when things like that happen, right? That you say, well, we cannot wait until that whole nation is underwater. We have to think about, are they going to need to be relocated and move, which is probably a good link to your questions.
So I think the answer is, it depends how people are moving to cities. Because if you think they're going to be less vulnerable, most of these new people that will be moving to cities will be living in slums, will be in places like Brazil, Central America, India, and they'll be living in slum conditions. And if you take two of the biggest threats, earthquakes and floods, you're the most vulnerable when you're in a slum, because you'll have things like in the wake of a disaster, sanitation will be awful, water access. So I think China's actually done fantastically at creating new cities from scratch, but you can't really replicate that somewhere like Honduras and Central America because there's just not the funding for it. So yeah, it's really, you know, about how it's planned. Can we go back to the insurance sector? Because I just want to talk about a sector that I have absolutely no experience of, but I have this philosophy. So there's something called a resilience bond, which may or may not exist yet. Does it exist, a resilience bond?
I don't
I
think
don't think it
as
does.
such.
Okay, right.
But there are
cat
things
bonds.
that are maybe close, but go on.
So the idea of a resilience bond, right? So say you take Puerto Rico. If a city that's been completely damaged by a natural catastrophe can prove that it's building back better and it's implementing resilient capacities, resilient adaptive strategies, like like these houses that are on they float up, then theoretically they could be offered a lower premium if they can prove they're building resilience. And the role of the insurance sector. Because I really, I'm humanitarian, but I think the insurance is gonna be the driving force behind protecting people in the next 50 years. So the role of the insurance sector is actually to provide incentive for government planners, for the infrastructure sector, to actually make an effort to build back better, to build in resilience. Because when there's that choice of we can build up back quickly and cheaply, or we can think about the structure and the layout of the city, lots of governments will go quickly and cheaply. They want quick wins. Whereas if they can see, actually my premium is reduced, so now I can actually get insurance for my sector, for my city, then that can have huge implications on protecting people in cities. So it's not, it's not
Absolutely,
black
and I think I need to invite you to our Innovation Lab sessions,
Job in
because that's
insurance
exactly
now.
the sort of work that we're doing as an industry together in looking at what does an insurance product that these developing countries and regions and so on are going to buy that not only make it attractive to them, but how do we attract them to actually do that sort of thing, right? Build better, be more resilient, and even buy the insurance. Because to go back to your question, Jay, by the way, and without wanting to get too technical, but people think, okay, well, there is not capital to cover some of these challenging risks. The interesting thing is there are a lot of investors. So if it's called, in our world, it's called alternative capital, which means it's not the capital that we as insurers hold, but there are investors out there that invest in totally different areas, and they say, oh, to balance my investment portfolio, to diversify it, I want to take some of that risk. Right? So that is what is very much in the last 15 years increasingly, and in the last years increasingly more and more, allowing us to continue to provide protection in countries, in regions that are increasingly very natural catastrophe prone. So there is that aspect. But absolutely, that is exactly the sort of thing that we are looking at. How do you build it so that it's actually attractive and effective? So rather than just fix, is improve the economic condition and build resilience.
Thanks. Sorry, I'll try and be really quick. We've touched on technology quite a few times, and I'm really interested to hear your perspectives on where you think the technology can play the greatest role in this, whether it's from the end user perspective of having a mobile phone for a humanitarian cash transfer, or IoT and the satellite industry and mapping and things like that.
Thanks. I'm going to pause and just take the second question, and then we'll answer both of them. Sorry, there's a bit of a...
Thank you. So my question relates to, how we present climate change as something really important that we need to act upon, but also balancing that with presenting climate change as one dynamic within a kind of broader web of dynamics that ultimately climate change exacerbates existing social and environmental issues. So I guess one of my questions for Francesca is, as well as looking, so you referred to domestic violence and the link between climate change and domestic violence, but I also wondered what other kind of, if you also considered other kind of factors and how they interact with climate change in your research.
I'll add very quickly on insurance. As I mentioned, in many of development markets, they don't have an inventory. If the government of country X wants to insure their state-owned government buildings, they don't know how many they have or exactly where they are, which, by the way, is not surprising because the UK doesn't know the train system. They don't know how many signals they have, and they're using actually artificial intelligence to actually go through the rails and count them. But anyway, so we are only able to insure in many parts of the world based on satellite imagery, right? That actually shows us, okay, if this is the size of this territory and this is sort of the space occupied by buildings, we can sort of reliably estimate this, and then we can actually, that's the way we can insure. And as you mentioned, also the fact that we have now the technology that can process that amount of data. We couldn't, if we did it by hand, it would take years. So that's one aspect, right? It really is enabling us to provide protection in areas that was not possible before. But also the example of the crops in Africa. If you have sensors on the ground that actually very quickly tell you, did that crop get enough rain or too much? That activates, that changes something to the speed. And very quickly, one last example, which I absolutely love. Met a woman working with an area in Latin America called El Chaco. It's 3 countries. It's sort of high flat mountains, very isolated. Of course, very, very, very low income. Companies like Samsung have been providing them with technology with satellite connection, because of course there's no Wi-Fi, there's no lines, landline telephone access or anything. Satellite connections, laptops, mobile phones, and they start to then register how much they're producing, so they know if they lose how much they're going to lose if we were to insure them. But they're actually using it to monitor the weather, so they know when storms are coming, they know what is happening, they can report. And they're also better prepared for when disaster happens. They are actually trained with it. And interestingly, by the way, they have found that it is the women that are actually taking the lead in a lot of the usage of technology, the preparedness exercises, taking charge, actually. So it has also had the side benefit of empowering women, because they have really embraced it. So really interesting things happening. Could be a community that otherwise would have been told to relocate, but technology is actually enabling them to stay where they are and have the right level of support. Interesting.
Thank you, Claudia. Francesca, do you want to address that second question?
Yeah, I'm just going to say one thing on technology, though. I think without a doubt, the best use of modern technology is early warning systems. So specifically for floods, if you can tell people 20 minutes, half an hour in advance that there's going to be a flood, it can have a serious impact on their decisions. And actually, technology now can map, because everyone's got a GPS tracker, everyone in the world has a GPS tracker in their pocket, can map what decisions people make in the case of a catastrophic flood. And then that information can be fed back. So the next time, we know what's the best advice to give to make people move to a place of safety, who made the bad decisions and why that was the case. So I think technology, its biggest impact is in communication. So on the question before about climate change and how it can sort of exacerbate existing issues. The one that I feel like I duped you a bit, because it says that would speak about water, and I haven't spoken anything about water. But I think the example of what happened in Cape Town is the biggest example of how climate change just reveals vulnerabilities. I don't know if you know, Cape Town nearly ran out of water in March, and it was catastrophic. And the causes of that were essentially laziness, because they hadn't diversified their water sources. So they were getting basically one reservoir they were using their water from. And every year they said, yeah, we'll invest in diversifying. But the chance of these perfect conditions happening where there'd be a drought on drought on drought were very slim. It was 1 in X, I don't know what the number is. So they took the risk. And what happened is climate change almost identified and revealed the poor managerial aspects within the city. And I think this is what we're going to see more and more in the future, is cities running out of water, not because of climate change, but climate change will reveal where the management of water systems in cities is actually being quite poor. What I found amazing about that situation as well is one of their solutions was to tow an iceberg from Antarctica. Did anyone hear this? It's like a child came up with their solution. They're like, well, let's just get on an iceberg. And actually, the reason it didn't work is because there was a chemical that was released when it was melted, but that's still something they're exploring. So I'd say in terms of climate change, the biggest challenge that's going to be faced in the next 50 years, there'll be millions of them, but the one that I think is most interesting is actually water distribution. Because we have enough fresh water in the world, that's not an issue. It's how do we get it to the places where everyone's moving into these cities, and it's putting real stress on their sort of water infrastructure. I could speak to you more over beers about water, because I feel a bit guilty. I didn't give enough on that.
Thank you very much to our panellists. I can't believe the diversity of what we've touched on in the last hour, and the sort of scale and scope of things. We've gone from the minutiae of household impacts of climate change right through to moving icebergs into cities. But can I just ask you to give a round of applause to our panellists this evening?